Reflections 8. Cross Country. Ted Neill. Grandpa was anything but a braggart. His war stories were unfailingly characterized by a self-effacing humility. As I was reminded when I called him from a gas station phone in the middle of Kansas in June 2000. I had just graduated from Georgetown University with my BA in English and Writing at the end of May. The very next morning, I hopped on a plane to join 9 other Georgetown students on a cross-country bike ride from San Francisco to Washington, D.C. We were raising money for organizations that supported children affected by and infected with HIV/AIDS. The ride was the idea of Mordecai, an enthusiastic, idealistic, and charming polysexual junior who was deeply conflicted about his sexual orientation and alarmingly narcissistic. Mordecai had been charismatic to persuade us to ride over 3,500 miles through blazing deserts, grueling mountains, windswept prairie, and humid lowlands. He had talked us into braving roaring semis, less than enlightened people throwing everything from beer cans to fireworks at us from moving cars, and dogs. So many goddamn dogs, chasing us and biting us in backwoods enclaves. Mordecai had also been successful at securing donated bikes, food, and supplies for the trip. He attracted media attention and even got himself invited to the White House. But once on the trip, Mordecai had abandoned all the logistical details of the trip to his long-suffering and overworked roommate and best friend, Thaddeus. While Thaddeus pored over maps, located gas stations, and worked the phones to ensure we had hotels and campgrounds, Mordecai cut a swath through the female riders, sleeping with one after another. Thaddeus, already tasked with riding 100 to 120 miles per day with the rest of us, got little sleep. He lost weight. Thaddeus also had the unlucky chore of driving an additional 100 miles in a support vehicle, after biking as much, in the evenings to come get me after I became lost. More than once. Mordecai continued to sow discord among the female riders and awkwardness amongst everyone else as he became infatuated with Thaddeus, too. This was betrayed by his uninvited keyholing of Thaddeus whenever he bent over. Mordecai was also working furiously on a screenplay in which 2 thinly veiled stand-ins for himself and Thaddeus led a charity ride across the U.S., in the course of which they discovered their undisclosed love for one another. It included a series of increasingly graphic sex scenes set in tents and campgrounds, a sort of Brokeback Mountain with bikes. Needless to say, by the Rockies, the 10 of us were a feuding mess. By Kansas, I had become lost and separated from the pack a total of 3 times. Still, it wouldn't be the last. Lost and waiting at a gas station for Thaddeus to pick me up, again, I called Grandpa. I spared him the details of the reality TV-like mess I had landed myself in. Instead, I asked him, "How did you ever lead 40 men of your platoon into enemy fire and hardened fortifications full of Nazis trying to kill you when I can't cooperate with 9 undergrads to ride from point A to point B in peacetime?" Grandpa's answer was typical, provided in understated, self-effacing, and simple terms. Sadly, print does not capture the long, pregnant pauses characteristic of his manner of speaking, but he gave a chuckle, either at my high-strung self and my situation, or maybe even himself. "Well, I'm not sure. I don't know if I wouldn't have cut and run myself if I hadn't been looking out for the men under me." It was, and wasn't, the answer I had expected. Half grown up with a certain image of the military hero, as depicted in Top Gun and Rambo, I guess I had expected some tough-as-nails talk about knuckling down on your fear, steeling yourself for battle, and manning up. Maybe I had even been hoping for something like the stirring speeches depicted in films with a background of swelling orchestral music. These were delivered by the actor of the moment, whose character would provide a stirring pep talk in the locker room at halftime to their players. It would be the turning point as their team struggled to come back from a disastrous first half and a deep deficit of plays and points. These were coaches depicted, in rotation, by the likes of Gene Hackman, Denzel Washington, Sean Astin, James Caan, Billy D. Williams, Al Pacino, etc. I admit, I had hoped for a speech that I could crib and repeat when Thaddeus picked me up, and we returned to the campground where the rest of the riders were resting before the next day's ride. In my own naive grandiosity, I pictured myself salvaging and saving our ride from disaster. Really, I had fallen into the same narcissistic trap as Mordecai, centering myself as hero/leader of everything. Grandpa knew better. Real life, not movies, had taught him as much. But I didn't have a word for the style of leadership he embodied. I wouldn't until I met my other mentors, Steve Olson and Jack Hoban, a decade and a half later.
Recollections of a GI 6. Robert Louis Fowler. July 1944. Omaha Beach. However, when we neared Omaha Beach, we could hear the big guns inland a few miles. We were wearing wool underwear and resin-impregnated clothing for waterproofing for the crossing and landing. It had been a month since D-Day, but there were still body parts floating in the water. We disembarked over the ship's side using the rope net ladders and wearing full packs and the protective clothing. We offloaded onto a flat barge which moved us to within 50 yards of the beach. Then we waded in. I stepped aside to let my platoon off and stepped into a hole that put the water over my head and my rifle on the bottom of the bay. I dove for it and retrieved it, filled my non-waterproof watch with salt water, and proceeded to shore. During our trip across the channel, we had numerous air raid drills. This meant, when the signal sounded, the people on the deck had to go down to A deck ASAP. There were ladders at each end of the holds. Each deck floor was a series of removable panels to permit loading or unloading of the lower decks. There was also a removable section around the bottom of the ladders and the end of each hold. During one of the air raid drills, Tom Ryan fell through one of the openings down about 25 feet to the deck where the jeeps were stored. He landed on the canvas top of one of the vehicles, his left shoulder across a metal bow supporting the canvas top, and wound up with a broken collarbone. It was truly the luck of the Irish he was not killed. This meant that I would take over as the platoon sergeant. Captain Lassiter permitted Ryan to stay on board ship and be treated by our own medics rather than be sent back to a hospital in England. At Ryan's request, Lassiter assigned him as first sergeant of the barracks bag crew. After we were offloaded, the barracks bags were moved and handled by the service company in their own 2.5-ton fleet. The bags were kept in a regimental concentration area near the kitchens for all the companies of the regiment, several miles behind the lines. After reaching the beach, we assembled into company formations and carried our gear, including our barracks bags, up from the beach to an assembly area a couple miles inland. At this time, we removed our impregnated clothing, the long wool underwear, and the fatigues, which were supposed to protect us from mustard gas. We smelled pretty bad after that short hike carrying duffel bags with all that clothing on the 5th of July. We were instructed to put on our B uniform, which was wool OD shirt and trousers. Guess fatigues looked too much like the German uniform. Then we were told to turn in our gas masks, which came as a surprise to all of us. In addition to having trained with these things and worn them during off-duty hours for 3 years, and having spent 4 days wearing the lousy impregnated clothing in July, we were told we didn't need them anymore. It seems British intelligence knew where all of Germany's gas depots were located, and could give us at least 24 hours warning before any gas attack could occur. We were glad to get rid of them, but it was very difficult to understand the earlier misinformation. July 1944. Normandy, France. After getting into more comfortable and seasonable clothing, we turned in our duffel bags and gas masks and formed up and moved out. By this time, the rumbling of the big guns was becoming more noticeable. We moved into an assembly area about 5 miles north of St. Lo. It was difficult to find wooded areas for concealment in the terrain we were in, but thank goodness we had air superiority and the Luftwaffe didn't dare show up during daylight. But our Air Force did not dare show up over Normandy after dark. Not because of the German Air Force, but because of our Navy gunners in the Channel and anti-aircraft in the area, both Allied and German. Our anti-aircraft gunners fired first and identified the aircraft when they hit the ground. Consequently, Allied tactical aircraft was grounded at 11 p.m. till dawn. This gave Bed Check Charlie free rein. Some areas in the Normandy pocket would get flares dropped on them and Stuka dive bombers would work us over a little. Service company got hit one night and there were a few casualties, but surprisingly light compared to the number of bombs dropped and the noise they made. It is a pretty helpless feeling to be under an air attack, but the only defense is a deep hole. July 8th through 14th, Valier-Fossard. On July 8th, the 2nd Battalion moved into a defensive position to relieve part of the 30th Division for a couple of days, then was withdrawn. The 134th was actually in Corps Reserve. We had been assigned to the 19th Corps, 1st Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Omar Bradley. On the night of July 13th, just after dark, we formed up to move out. As we went by the kitchen truck, we emptied our pockets of billfolds and anything that would identify where we came from. My wallet contained the 90 that belonged to the L Company Special Fund, and it was the last I ever saw any of my possessions. I was told later that the mess sergeant had a hell of a good time in Paris after it was liberated. Those of us in the 3rd Battalion moved into the line to relieve what was left of the 115th Infantry Division. The 29th was a National Guard division for Maryland and Virginia, known as the Blue and Gray. They were a good outfit, and had been chosen as one of the divisions to make the initial landings at Omaha Beach. The 1st Division, Big Red 1, and the 29th were landed on Omaha Beach on June 6th. The 29th had been in the line since D-Day, and was exhausted and worn down terribly. Our 3rd Battalion moved in and took over their forward positions at Valier-Fossard, a little village about 3 miles from St. Lo. Our positions looked up toward Hill 122. Hill 122 will forever be etched in the memories of all the men that had served overseas and entered combat with the 134th Infantry. Moving up to our positions and taking over from the 29th on the night of July 13th, 1944 is the date all of us in the 3rd Battalion will remember. It started as we moved out, single file past the chow truck. The mess sergeant was standing there holding a gunny sack, and we were told to put our wallets and any letters, etc., in it. Everything but pay card, dog tags, and handkerchief. Prior to our move out that night, Regimental Commander Colonel Miltenberger had a meeting with all senior sergeants. He told us how much everything depended on us and passed on some combat tips that had been related to him by people who had already experienced combat. After the meeting, the squad leaders in my platoon gave me one of my most cherished moments when they came as a group to tell me they were glad that I was platoon sergeant and of their confidence in me. I hope they felt the same way after combat. 2 of them were killed in the next 3 days, and all the rest were wounded by the time we made it into St. Lo on the 18th. There were times later when I sure needed someone's encouragement, because things happened in combat that the uninitiated cannot possibly conceive or imagine. The move up was rather quiet. No one talked much, if at all. Each one of us had our own thoughts of family going through our heads, wondering if we would ever see them again. My greatest fear was that I might not be able to control my fear. I was not alone with this, We all had our pride and self-esteem, and to lose it in the eyes of our buddies was as bad as death. We did have a few people who did go completely berserk. Some even shot themselves in the foot to avoid actual combat. I can't imagine how they could live with themselves afterwards, but the instinct for self-preservation can take many forms and overcome reasonable behavior. We moved into a forward assembly area and spread our men out so that no one was closer than 10 yards from anyone else. This was being dispersed, as called for in field manuals. The idea is that no one round of artillery or mortar fire will cause more than 1 or 2 casualties. Needless to say, there was no smoking. I'd learned to chew tobacco, and it was a good substitute. Any lights or unnecessary noise could cause us to be shelled. It was a known fact that a lighted match or cigarette would be put out with a .30 caliber bullet, maybe even fired by a friend. After the troops were dispersed, and I knew where my squad leaders and platoon leader were, I looked around for the 3rd platoon. My closest friend, Leo Sampson, was the platoon sergeant of the 3rd. We knew we might not see each other for a while, possibly never, so we felt compelled to get together to wish each other luck. We'd hung out since we were 13 years old, having met in 1934, and we knew each other as well as brothers. We'd shared most all the things life had to offer, and now we were facing something that was truly overwhelming. We did satisfy each other that we were at peace from a religious standpoint, and we knew there were no atheists in foxholes. Someone had scrounged some cognac and others some wine, and it was being passed around, sparingly. No one was about to take more than a couple swigs, for obvious reasons. Before we had left the States, the 2nd platoon received a new platoon leader. His name was Lou Daly from Hastings, Nebraska. He had originally been in G Company 134, and had gone to the Aleutian Islands with the old 2nd Battalion. After some time up there, he was allowed to go to OCS and was commissioned a 2nd lieutenant. He wasn't a very big guy, but he was wiry and intelligent, and was liked by all. He spent quite a bit of time as an enlisted man, so he had the leadership qualities we respected. One of our first actions before moving up was to remove our sergeant stripes, and the officers muddied the bars on their helmets. Officers had a white strip about 1 inch wide and 4 inches long vertically on the back of their helmets, and we NCOs had them placed horizontally. This was our only designation of authority. Our men knew us by voice, so it was no problem. All of this because of the large number of German snipers. They would hide in the trees, etc., and wait for leaders as targets. We even eliminated addressing each other by rank or sir, and of course, no saluting. Most of us were on a first-name basis, and Lou Daly was one of us right away. By dawn on July 14th, 1944, we were in the same foxholes the 29th had left from. We had to dig a few because the boys of the 29th were pretty low in strength by that time. They'd lost a lot of people on Omaha Beach, and they had to fight their way to the point where we relieved them. They'd received replacements several times, but even with replacement they had tried to take Hill 122 several times without gaining any ground. One of my first memorable combat exploits was having to go to the toilet. The toilet consisted of a little hole about 6 inches deep to be covered after use. A person feels very vulnerable at half-mast in a squatting position. Some people claimed they'd been shot at in this position, had tried to run for cover and buckle their belt, all at the same time. Our platoon was deployed in an L-shaped position, with one of the L parallel to a ravine on our right flank. The lieutenant and I checked each individual position for field of fire, cover, and concealment. We paired up our people and adopted the buddy system. One of them had to lie awake at all times. One of the first things we had to learn was when you have the opportunity to sleep, you should do so. We were in a static defensive situation at the time, and it was rare for us to be so. During the day, on July 14th, the commander of the 1st Battalion with his recon group was in our area. They were making their plans for the attack on July 15th.
The 2nd Battalion was doing the same thing in I Company area. The plan was that the 1st and 2nd Battalions would move through the 3rd Battalion on the morning of the 15th in the attack on Hill 122. Hill 122 was the high ground north of St. Lo, and whoever controlled Hill 122 controlled St. Lo. The 134th was to take St. Lo by the 18th of July.
July 15th, Hill 122. The morning of July 15th started a day that will be in the history of the 134th Infantry forever. Whether a military action is noted in history by the number of casualties, the ground gained, or the ammunition expended, those of us who were a part of it feel that at least one of the next 3 days on the way to St. Lo was the toughest ever. The reason for one day being worse than another depends on the company a person was a part of and its assignment. On the 15th, the 1st and 2nd Battalions attacked. The 1st Battalion gained about 1,000 yards. In those days, that gain was fantastic. The price they paid was horrible. Most units had 60% casualties by noon, but they were still pushing and proving that all hell can't stop us. The casualty rate among lieutenants and sergeants was appalling, but it did demonstrate that they were out there leading their troops in the tradition in which we were taught. After the 1st Battalion passed through us, the sound of exploding artillery and mortar shells was a continuous roar. Occasionally, you could hear someone screaming for a medic, but most of the time it was too noisy for a voice to be heard. Lou Daly and I had a dugout in the hedgerow corner with a door from an old building as a roof with dirt piled on top. Hedgerows provided protection towards the enemy, since they were 4 or 5 feet above ground level. Lou Daly set up a plan for us to alternate moving from flank to flank through our platoon area to let our troops know we weren't in our holes, and also to show them we were concerned about them. This was my first personal experience of having to move around during a time when it seemed there were explosions all around me. We did have a couple of men get hit with shrapnel that came through the openings of their dugouts. Lou and I took turns going from hole to hole until afternoon. Just when I got back from one of my turns and had crawled into our dugout where Lou and our 2 runners were already in place, an 88 hit directly on the other side of the hedgerow that formed the upper parts of the wall of the dugout. The roof with the dirt piled on it caved in on us.
Reflections 9. Foxhole. Ted Neill. One evening, while sitting on the porch in Ogallala with Grandpa and Leo, I made some throwaway remark about a local politician campaigning porch to porch for an upcoming election. His first name was Nelson. Plain-spoken and exceedingly polite, he shook all our hands and stood with his foot propped on the second step of the porch, sliding the band of his own Stetson up off his sweaty forehead. Leo offered him some lemonade and introduced me and Grandpa, the 4 of us chatting more like neighbors than anything else. Nelson never explained what party he was from or even mentioned a single issue or plank of his platform. This led me to consider the face-to-face with potential voters a complete failure on his part. I said as much after Nelson thanked us for the lemonade and left. I went on to announce to Grandpa and Leo that I thought Nelson was lacking the sophistication and polish needed for success in the blood sport of politics and possibly life. I was all too ready to relegate him into some weaker and useless category of human being. Looking back on it, I know my comments were less about Nelson than myself. An attempt to seek validation for a certain type of cutthroat ambition being bred into me in the high-income, highly educated suburb of Washington, D.C., where I was growing up. Also, as a teen, having been traveling with 2 war heroes for the past week, I know I was also trying to feel out the borders of an acceptable model of manhood. At 17, I was figuring out my own way to be in the world. Given my overconfident critique of Nelson, I realize I had, prematurely, concluded that I had discerned the outline of what a real man was. Having reached this wise and informed conclusion, I was eager to show off my understanding by pointing out what, I was certain, were all of Nelson's failings. What I was really, desperately seeking was the approval of these two men and an initiation into a respectful form of masculinity that I thought they embodied. I should have known I had erred when Leo let out a less than muffled snort. I took it as agreement, derision aimed at Nelson as he made his way down the block, stepping over children's toys, lawn sprinklers, and through latched garden gates to, pitifully, shake more hands. For the briefest of moments, I reveled in the satisfaction of having figured it all out. Nelson was a mild-mannered, middle-aged milksop. I, by contrast, under the mentorship of these two men, was on my way to an invincible, inconquerable manhood. Having been a lean, bullied, sensitive boy growing up, I was basking in the sense of being one of the men, for once in my life. And I hadn't hesitated to bully someone else. But I had it wrong. And, of course, Leo's derision had been for me. But like one good officer who sees another officer's man out of line, Leo let my own commander put me in my place. Grandpa answered after a long pause, my mind already having moved elsewhere.
You'd be surprised, Ted. Who would jump out of a foxhole and run by your side to charge the enemy?
I thought another war story was coming, but it only dawned on me slowly that Grandpa was talking about the present. A long pause followed. A few cars rolled past. A lawn sprinkler made a few revolutions. Leo waved at a couple of children catching lightning bugs. Grandpa continued.
Guy like Nelson there. He'd be the first one out beside you. You wouldn't have to worry about him hanging behind. He'd have your back.
More to my shame, it wasn't until years later that I realized just how far I had misstepped, and that this was actually a soft but firm rebuke from Grandpa. Over time, and since confirmed by reading his memoir, I came to realize Grandpa and Leo's deep affection for what I, in my East Coast college-educated snobbery, would have considered the common man. Men like Nelson. Men like themselves. Having seen so much of human nature tested in life or death circumstances, Grandpa and Leo had more intuition, ability, and right to judge a man or woman's character and how they might perform under the worst stress than I did. Even so, they were both slow to pass judgment aloud, a great contrast to me in my teenage arrogance. Nelson went on to win the election and served in local government for many years. Grandpa and Leo had confidence, after interacting with him just a few minutes, that he'd pass their test of character. The jury was still out on me.
Recollections of a GI, 7. Robert Louis Fowler. July 15th. Continued. Lou Daly was almost completely covered, and we were all a little stunned. I had a hot piece of shrapnel only about the size of a BB embedded just under the skin. I dug it out and forgot about it until the point system for wounds came out after VE Day. By this time, the 1st Battalion had gained enough ground, so we in the 3rd Battalion moved out to the right flank of the 1st Battalion. We were moving over to our right toward the road that leads from Villers-Fossard to St. Lo. We thought the 320th was on our regimental right, and that their left boundary was the road. But, in reality, they were not that far forward, so our flank was open. We got out to the road and turned left toward St. Lo after some delay. The man I had picked as my second-in-command was fatally wounded by a sniper. He was still alive when we last saw him. The medics picked him up, and he died a couple of days later. As we proceeded up the road toward St. Lo, our platoon was leading out with column files on each side of the road. We passed an opening in a hedgerow between the road and a field to our right, and we received enemy machine gun fire right through the opening. It then became obvious that the 320th was not abreast of us on our right flank, and that we were exposed. The battalion commander had me send a squad to try to neutralize the enemy machine gun. Mole Owens had a rifle with a grenade launcher, so Colonel Thompson told him to use the grenade on the machine gun. Owens put a live round in the chamber of his M1 and fired. There was supposed to be a blank to propel the grenade to the target. It happened that the colonel was standing close by, and he and Owens were both splattered with little specks of lead. Their faces looked like they had a pox with little drops of blood. Neither was hit in the eyes. In the effort to eliminate the enemy machine gun, PFC John Quinn was killed with a bullet through the head. Later, we proceeded up the road, and our squad was still involved in a firefight on the right flank. Wes Wright was shot through the back of his neck, a little to the left of center, and the bullet came out through his right cheek. When I saw him, I thought he was shot through the mouth, as he was lying on his left side in a ditch. About this time, a German tank started spacing rounds down along the road. Also, mortars were dropping in the road up and down the column. Everyone hit the ditches, including me. I can't remember how long this lasted, but it seemed like forever. The shelling finally stopped, and we found that the colonel and his command group were cut off from the rest of us. We'd been bypassed by the command group when we were involved with the machine gun on our right flank. Major Wyant, the executive officer, took command and had us move back down the road and into a field where we could disperse. About dusk, I had to send a squad to battalion headquarters to go on a patrol up to where we were, to see if they could find the colonel. I had to pick a squad. I had the squad leaders draw straws, although I warned them they would be taking their turn in the future. It turned out to be Ralph McManaman's squad. They returned a couple of hours later, and no results. Colonel Thompson and his group were able to crawl their way to safety and return to the battalion. July 16th. The morning of the 16th, the 3rd Platoon led off, and we found that some enemy had infiltrated across the road. They were routed, and the 1st Platoon took up the attack. The battalion moved up to Emily during the day. After hard fighting by the 1st Platoon, led by 1st Lieutenant Greenleaf and Tactical Sergeant John Cantoni. During that day, their 42-man platoon dwindled to 10. The Germans had the advantage of prepared positions to keep moving back to a supply of ammunition waiting for them. We had to carry our ammo with us, and being on the attack without the help of artillery is as tough as it gets. At dusk, the 1st Platoon was holding their position where they had stopped, and the 2nd was right behind them, and the 3rd was behind us. About midnight, I was called to company headquarters and told I would have to lead my platoon with the rest of the company behind it over across the St. Lo Road and make contact with K Company. Then we would move into a position ready to attack at 0430, July 17th. We were able to get into a hole and pull a raincoat over the top of us and look at a map by flashlight. This was the first time I had even seen a map since we landed in France. July 17th. At 0400, I wondered why I ever wanted to be a sergeant or anything else except a buck private. I was to lead what was left of a company of men over strange terrain with plenty of enemy nearby, 200 yards, maybe closer. And what was more, I wasn't reconnaissance sergeant, but Captain Lassiter wanted it this way, and there it was. I made the move and contacted a lieutenant from K Company. They were to be on our right flank and move out the same time as us at 0430. There was a ground haze, or fog, and at 0430 it was very dark and quiet. We were to attack without any artillery preparation on the theory that preparatory artillery always acted as a signal for the Germans to harden their defenses in anticipation for a ground attack. We'd been surprised at how much machine gun fire the enemy could deliver even when they were not prepared. We hoped to catch them by surprise this morning. Lou Daly's plan of attack was that he would take 2 squads forward and I would follow with the other squad. I was to employ them where I saw fit when I received word from Daly to do so. After 100 yards or so, the Kraut machine gun opened up. We had run smack into their MLR, main line of resistance.
This was where they were to hold ground at all costs. We were suffering heavy casualties, and finally I sent the reserve squad to the left, even though I hadn't heard from Daly. During this time, I had one of my launchermen try to launch a grenade on the machine gun position, hitting us from over on our right. The problem was, we'd been getting some dud grenades caused by a safety sleeve not sliding back by the time the grenade arrived at target. To compensate, I removed the grenade from the launcher and removed the sleeve, but while putting the grenade back, the safety lever slipped out of my grip. The grenade should have blown, but my finger got stuck between the firing pin and the percussion cap. It was safe as long as my finger was in there. Then I had a horrible thought that if I were to get hit, reflexes would cause me to pull my finger out, and I would have to get rid of the grenade in 4.5 seconds, if I was still conscious to get rid of it at all. 4.5 seconds is the time the fuse burns after the striker pin hits the percussion cap, which gives time to throw the grenade, and for it to arrive at the target. I couldn't run the risk of getting hit and dropping the live grenade so close to the other men. I had to get rid of it. I searched for a place to ditch it, found a depression in the ground, and threw the grenade in there. It exploded without harming anyone in the immediate area. It was after daylight when I received word through Sergeant Lloyd of the 3rd Platoon that Captain Lassiter had ordered us to pull back. We'd seen our wounded coming back and knew we were in bad shape, so we had called Colonel Thompson and received permission to pull back. I Company would replace us and resume attack. We didn't know it at the time, but we had killed a large number of the enemy and could probably have moved forward with the men we had left, but we never gave any thought to it at the time. I crawled up to where Lou Daly was and informed him of the withdrawal order. He said take the left side and we would take the right and get back any men that were still alive. This took some time and it was tough finding the men that were killed. I moved back myself to the location where Daly said to meet him. He was in a shell hole. I could see his head sticking up over the edge. I was standing and yelling about 10 yards away that my side was all clear. He started to answer me, and I saw his head drop, and he went limp. I rushed over to him and saw that a piece of shrapnel had gone through his mouth from the front, and had gone through the throat and was in the back of his neck. He bled to death in a matter of a few seconds. His radio operator had been kneeling beside the hole when it happened and didn't get a scratch. I took him with me and reported back to Captain Lassiter. It wasn't long until the usual counterattack came. It was beaten back successfully by our return fire after we got reorganized. Many of the men were in foxholes behind the original hedgerow that we went over when we started out at 04:30 that morning. After what they had been through the last 3 days, they were reluctant to get up and fire back to stop the counterattack. Lieutenant Greenleaf and I immediately started moving up and down the hedgerow, getting the men up into firing position. We did receive a mortar barrage that had us all back in those holes. When it was over, we knew they would be coming, but we were ready, and they never even got close. We picked enough off that they got discouraged rather quickly. It was our turn to fire from a protected position, and they were out in the open on the move. During this time, I remember one of the men by the name Marion Pennington. He'd been mobilized with us on December 23, 1940, and had been in the National Guard before that. His civilian job had been as an elevator operator at the local YMCA building. He was pink-faced and pudgy, and lacked the ordinary coordination expected of most men of those days. We'd tried several times when we were stateside to get him to take a discharge. He knew he didn't have to, and said he joined the outfit to fight for his country. And he meant it. When I saw Penny that day just prior to the counterattack, he was not one of those we had to pry out of the foxhole to fire back. He had his bazooka across the hedgerow, and he cussed me because I wouldn't load it for him. I told him that we had to save the ammo in case of tank attack, and I gave him my M1 to use and found myself another. I will always remember his statement that he joined the outfit to fight for his country. When it came time for us to move out of the position we were in, Captain Lassiter told Lieutenant Greenleaf we would need an automatic weapon on the other side of the road that we had to cross and somewhat follow the route we had come a couple days before in order to get back to a covered position to reorganize due to the heavy casualties. The next thing I knew, Greenleaf picked up a BAR, Browning automatic rifle, and hollered, "Bob, grab an extra bar cartridge belt and let's go." It wasn't an order, just something we had to do. He dashed across the road, and a few seconds later I did too. I was thinking he surprised the Krauts first, but they would be waiting for me. The road we crossed went right into enemy position, so we expected fire from them. However, what was left of Company L crossed the road on the run, one man at a time. Greenleaf and I had set up our gun position to answer any fire we might receive. As the company withdrew, Greenleaf and I did a rearguard action to cover them until they were all safely back to the reorganization area. We both were glad that the rearguard action didn't require the sacrifice seen in the movies or sometimes during the real thing. Getting back to the unit and checking who was left was a very painful procedure. Normally an infantry company had 187 men. Subtract 17 men such as mess sergeant and cooks, KPs, truck drivers, clerks, and you have 170 men on the line. Each rifle platoon has 42 men and the weapons platoon the balance, except for company headquarters, which was a first sergeant, communication sergeant, and 4 runners in the command group. Lieutenant Greenleaf had 10 men left in his first platoon. Sergeant Cantoni, his platoon sergeant, had been wounded earlier that day, rifle bullet through the left lung. He'd walked back to the medics under his own power. I had 6 men left, and I'd lost second platoon leader, Lieutenant Lou Daly. The third platoon was not in as bad shape as the first and second platoons, but they were down 50%. Both Lieutenant Campbell and my buddy Leo Sampson were okay. The weapons support platoon had lost its platoon leader. An artillery shell hit a tree above him, and although not scratched, he went berserk and started running around in circles, chasing imaginary enemy. We never heard how he turned out, if ever. Sergeant Jerry Sokol was in charge of weapons platoon, and they had their share of casualties, but not near as bad as the rifle platoons. The first and second platoons were combined temporarily under command of Lieutenant Greenleaf and me as platoon sergeant. After a few more minor reassignments, we formed up to move out. Our platoon had reorganized in a small field on one side of a road, and the third platoon had used a little field on the other side of the road. It happened that I came through the gate out to the road, and there was Leo Sampson at the head of his platoon also coming out. Just a glance and a nod are all there was, but there were 1,000 words unsaid. We headed out up the road back toward the area where we'd lost so many men. I started thinking of what I could have done to save them. And I had such a sad and remorseful feeling come over me that I started crying like a baby. The company commander thought I might be losing it, but I told him that I'd just felt such sorrow. I'd lost Daly, McManaman, Thierry, Quinn, Dick Campbell, Pellegrino, and several others. All these men from my platoon, and some were very close. A sergeant isn't supposed to have close friends in his platoon, but we'd been together a long time. Some of us for 3 years. I remembered a discussion we had back in England before we crossed the channel. It was just we sergeants of the second platoon, and we were talking about going into combat. We all expected that, being infantry, we would get wounded at some point. We were naming the wounds we wanted to avoid if possible in their severest order. First, we didn't want to get killed. Next, we didn't want to lose our eyesight. Then we didn't want anything to happen to our masculinity. Then we didn't want to lose an arm or leg. We'd settle for a nice little flesh wound that could be sewed up easily. We moved forward to a position about 300 yards in the rear of the 2 assault companies, I and K. Then it was digging in until we were told to move up and relieve I Company, which had relieved us earlier in the day. We moved into our position, and then we were told to display our position marking panels. The Air Force sent a recon plane with cameras, and this would give the higher headquarters our forward positions, in order to put the finishing touches on Operation Cobra. Reflections 10. Ghosts. Ted Neill. I found, in reading Grandpa's story, little moments, oblique references that became loose threads that I followed to a more profound understanding of him and an appreciation for the choices he made. It gave me insight into why his men followed him and trusted him as a leader. The most telling moment was the choice to hand over his M1 rifle to Private First Class Marion Pennington, Penny, while under enemy fire. There was something so inherently counterintuitive to it, Giving somebody else your weapon while under fire? What sort of instinct for survival was that? But on reflection, my lack of comprehension was indicative of my own selfishness, making me realize that I had missed the profound meaning in that lesson Grandpa offered me so many years ago on that bike ride. That humble admission that even he might have cut and run had it not been for his obligations to his men. As usual, I had failed to grasp the true importance of what he had shared. Mine was an attitude of self-preservation. Grandpa's, self-sacrifice. The wisdom was also there, hidden in his soft rebuke for me on Leo's porch, after I had dismissed candidate Nelson. Grandpa had been trying to help me not to make the same mistake he had, the mistake of underestimating someone else. In Grandpa's case, it had been the uncoordinated, pink-faced and pudgy Private First Class Penny, the Nelson of his era, who had done nothing more glamorous in his previous life than operate an elevator at the local YWCA. Grandpa and his cohorts had tried hard to convince Penny to drop out, having come to their own premature opinion regarding the mettle of his character. But in the line of fire, Grandpa saw Penny for who he was, determined, courageous, and heroic. And like a good leader, Grandpa gave Penny what he needed, even if it meant more danger for himself. Steve Olson, my boss at the Center for Ethics and Leadership, and Jack Hoban would stress to me that, in the simplest sense, a leader is the person, man or woman, who goes first. This often means risk. The risk can be mild, such as receiving criticism, or it can be severe, such as being shot as the first person out of the trench. Steve Olson would explain to me that, although many people envy the perks they see associated with leadership, especially corporate ones, leadership for many others simply amounts to task and risk avoidance. We're actually much happier to let leaders do the hard work, to take the risk of making hard decisions. Then we don't have to. This is especially true when it means being the first out of the trench, the first to be shot at, shot down, and shot dead. This was the value Steve saw in bringing business and NGO leaders to Quantico to get a taste of the leadership and ethics training Marines receive. Removing civilian leaders from their all-too-safe environments of boardrooms and C-suites and putting them under fire, even simulated, would help them better understand what real leadership was. Real leadership means risk, means sacrifice, even of yourself. Not just your own parking space or flying first class. The term servant leadership has been in vogue among leadership coaches, corporate consultancies, and throughout the leadership literature. Peer-reviewed journals and New York Times bestsellers extol its virtues. The concept of servant leadership is not new. Lao Tzu wrote about it in the Tao Te Ching. So did the Indian philosopher Chanakya in the Arthashastra around 400 or 500 years BCE. Servant leadership boils down to a style of leadership that, in contrast to traditional notions of top-down authority, puts the needs of others first. The obligation of the leader is to wield power and distribute resources to help others develop to their best ability. The servant leader is successful when those he or she serves, those under him or her, fulfill their potential and perform their best. Leadership exists to serve the needs of the followers, to bring them up, to empower and equip them, not the other way around. Centuries later, Bill Wilson, founder of AA, describes servant leadership as leadership not on top, but on tap, picturing it as a spring or a reservoir for others to benefit from. In Christian tradition, scholars point to Jesus' teachings to his disciples, specifically in Mark 10:42-45, as an example. Whoever wants to become great among you must be a servant, and whoever wants to be first must be servant to all. The concept reemerged and increased in popular use as a result of Robert K. Greenleaf's essay, The Servant as a Leader, first published in 1970. Done right, servant leadership creates great leaders and inspires men and women to do extraordinary things. But it exacts an emotional toll on the leader who takes its principles seriously. For the leader carries a commitment, devotion, and even love for his followers in his heart. So it was no surprise to me to read how Grandpa cried like a baby as he returned to a more secure position and realized that out of the 42 men in his company, only 6 had survived. His company, going up against the main line of resistance of the Nazis, well entrenched and well prepared and with an understanding of the stakes, had suffered the worst casualties of their battalion. The Allied generals had determined that it was possible to overcome static, fortified positions, but only by overwhelming them with numbers. This meant high casualty counts reported to HQ in the columns of carbon-copied morning after-action reports. On the lines, it meant friends with names and not just numbers dying in your arms. It meant the living carrying the burden of loss and the guilt of survival with them for life. The grief would never leave Grandpa. I think over the decades it just compounded, as I learned in 1995. While on our trip across Nebraska, Grandpa had said to me that even after going to war and losing so many men, after losing his Evelyn to cancer, it had been losing a child that had been worst for him. In 1953, my Uncle Mike went into the hospital for a routine tonsillectomy. Something went wrong with the anesthesia, and Michael, at the age of 5, died on the operating table. My mother's lasting image of her father that day was of him weeping in the corridor, clutching Michael's favorite toy. It was a horse figurine of the brown and white Indian variety. The leg had broken off. Michael had asked his father to fix it for months. Grandpa had promised he would, but never did. That day, in 1953, in the hospital corridor, Grandpa also cried like a baby, trapped in a hell of his own self-condemnation. He had no words of comfort for any of his reeling children, my mother, my Aunt Marianne, and my Aunt Elise. They had lost their brother and were reeling themselves, but he was incapable of providing the comfort a father is expected to. Instead, he cried into his hands, holding Michael's broken horse, saying only, over and over again, "I never fixed it. I never fixed it." This loss would further manifest in an emotional distance, a cruel coldness even, that Grandpa had for the next youngest child, my Aunt Elise. She would grow up on the far side of a chasm of disregard from her father as he kept himself separated in his grief. Hence, the only time he embraced her was to smother a grease fire. Later, as Grandpa was taking steps towards sobriety, the grief would transform into a doting interest in his youngest daughter and last child, Sally. My mother and the other older siblings saw this as the overcompensation it was. For the first time, after 7 previous children, Robert Louis Fowler changed one of his children's diapers. He was attentive and emotionally available to Sally in ways he had never been to his other children. This left his other children jealous, the resentment emerging in cutting asides and snide digs at family gatherings, even today. I once heard my own mother, after a few drinks, remark to a blindsided Sally that I had to change everyone's diapers growing up. Then you came along and Dad was suddenly interested and changed yours. Evelyn and Bob never thanked my mother, Kathy, even though some of my aunts remember her doing more for them than their own mother growing up. Mom left for nursing school and the East Coast burnt out, determined to never have a large family herself and to never move back to Omaha. Returning to that scene of Grandpa weeping for Michael, though, I can't help but see the parallels between that moment and that day in Normandy, when the counts came in and he knew that 80% of the men who had run out of the foxhole behind him were dead. I feel some certainty that the tears he wept for Michael were also for those brothers he had lost, surrogate sons whom he felt responsible for, whom, when they were struck down by bullets or blasted into pieces by mortars and mines, he could not fix. The trauma of it was likely contributing to his heavy drinking even then. And even in old age, the pain had not left him. While in France for the 50th anniversary of D-Day, Coco told me that at a GI dinner hosted by the residents of St. Lo, during a speech from the current mayor, Grandpa's gaze drifted away from the stage to the corner of the room where a few young children were waiting. These were all children of primary school age, whispering and admonishing one another in French, which Grandpa didn't speak. But the language between older siblings trying to corral younger ones is universal and timeless. Grandpa watched these children of the French families he and his men had liberated and was seized with weeping once more. Whether he saw his own children, his own comrades, or just a vision of childhood innocence, I'm not sure. I am certain, though, that this was a clue that his return trip to the scenes of battle was not all about triumphalism and victory. Nowhere was this clearer to me than in the image that came to represent the climax of that trip in 1994. It was the moment Grandpa, as one of the few survivors of the fighting on Hill 122, stood before the monument erected in memory of the men who gave their lives to liberate St. Lo. A photographer captured Grandpa as he stepped up to the memorial, a wreath of flowers in his arms, his eyes full of emotion. His mouth parted, its corners downturned. He wears the expression of a man overwhelmed with emotion, out of step with the grateful adults and happy children waving small American and French flags in the background. They are cheerful. Grandpa is haunted. The picture would go on to be published across the front page of the Omaha World Herald, the very same newspaper that had breathlessly described the 35th Division's victorious march across France, Belgium, and to the borders of Germany as they defeated Hitler's best troops 50 years before. The picture of Grandpa from St. Lo would be reproduced, framed, and hung in living rooms of family, extended family, and friends. My mother and father hung it next to Grandpa's medals after his death. The picture became the lasting symbol of his service. Most viewed it as festive and celebratory. But I never saw it like that, and still don't. After reading his memoirs, after reflecting on his life, I see Grandpa's eyes now and I recognize, as Edward Tick says, the eyes of a man who, like so many soldiers, carried a cemetery in his heart. Ghosts followed him, whether they were Michael's, or his other son Joe, whom he would also bury in his lifetime, or the men he couldn't save, the lives he could not fix, losses he had no answer for. We'll never know. And even after clawing back a few decades of sobriety, banishing those ghosts along with his whiskey and gin bottles, eventually those ghosts would get the best of him again, tormenting him into a drunkard's death.
Recollections of a GI 8. Robert Louis Fowler. July 18th. We spent the night in the positions that we took over from I Company. The next morning was July 18th, 1944. We were waiting for our resupply of ammo, food, and water, which normally would have been brought up to us under cover of darkness. Since we'd received no word as to a reason for no supply, Captain Lassiter feared we might be cut off from the rear. I was told to take a combat patrol of 12 men and go back to get ammo and rations and fight our way if necessary. I was given authority to pick any men from the company I wanted. I picked Matt Lloyd from 3rd Platoon and Al Grobe from the 1st Platoon. The rest of the 12 I don't recall. Lloyd was to be my second in command, and I kept Grobe as my partner since we never operated alone because of snipers. In addition to getting our supplies, the CO wanted me to pick up some gear he'd left in a foxhole in our old positions of 2 days before. We proceeded back approximately a mile without any problems. We came upon the reason for all the delay in supply. During the previous night, the jeeps and trailers from each of the rifle companies in the battalion were bringing up our supplies, and the lead jeep, which belonged to I Company, had tried to go around an American tank knocked out by a mine a couple of days before. The I Company jeep also hit a mine, and was blown into a pile of torn and twisted metal that defied identification. I saw the body of the driver in a field where it had landed. His intestines were strung out on nearby trees, and his torso was split open from his neck to his crotch. It appeared there was not a piece of bone in his body more than 2 inches long. The road they were on was a sunken road with a bank on each side 6 or 8 feet high and also steep. The road level was 4 or 5 feet lower than the field level on the other side of either bank, and also trees and bushes grew out from the top of the banks like all the hedgerows in the area. The minefield had to be cleared before the rest of the jeeps could proceed. They were later backed up and rerouted, but this took a lot of precious time. I immediately turned the patrol over to Sergeant Lloyd and had them take all the supplies they could hand carry and return to the company. I kept Al Grobe with me and located the items Jungle Jim wanted, and also located some bodies of L Company men that had not been picked up by the Graves registration people. We came upon an American soldier from the 320th taking items like watches and rings from the bodies of our dead. I clicked off my safety on my rifle and was prepared to kill him on the spot, but Grobe talked me out of it. The bad part about it was that we had no time to arrest him and turn him in. We had to send him back to his unit and hope he got there in time to get shot by the enemy. We returned to the company with no more incidents, except I found an M1 to replace the one I gave Pennington a few days before. I was able to check out the 0 of the weapon on a suspected sniper position in a tree some distance in back of us. I had some tracer ammo so I could fire and adjust the sights very easily. Not long after we returned to the company, we moved out into the attack. Outside of a few stray rounds of artillery, we didn't have any problems for several hundred yards. Along about 6 p.m. that evening, we had stopped to straighten out our formation and organize for one more attack forward. Jake Sass took a patrol down along the road towards St. Lo until he encountered the enemy. He returned and passed on the location where enemy fire had come from. In the meantime, our position had been discovered by the enemy. We received a pretty tough artillery attack until 3 Air Force Thunderbirds, P-47s, came along and evidently saw the gun flashes of the German artillery. We saw them strafe and bomb, and we received no more enemy fire for quite a while after that. We formed up for our last assault towards St. Lo. It was the 18th of July, 1944, and we were to have St. Lo without fail on this date. We were to move out behind a rolling barrage of our own artillery. We had some difficulty getting the guys to move out. They dug foxholes while we were delayed, and leaving that protection was tough. We all knew what going into the attack meant: marching, fire, and casualties. I looked at the other end of our hedgerow we had to go over to start off our attack, and Lieutenant Greenleaf was standing on the hedgerow and waving the men to follow. I did likewise on my end until we got them all moving. After the men were moving, Greenleaf told me to take a couple of volunteers down a sunken trail that was between us and the 3rd platoon and parallel to our direction of attack. We knew the enemy could come up the trail and get at our flanks, so we would deny them this and use it ourselves. I was able to get Gordon Weeks and Bill Bailey with a BAR, and we took off down the trail, firing a few rounds ahead of us, and made good progress. After a while, I had to climb a bank to see if we were ahead or behind the attacking platoons. I found that we were okay. Greenleaf told me to take over the platoon and have Weeks go down the trail. We were to keep up the attack on into St. Lo, which was just ahead of us. Once we'd gotten the men moving and we were having such good results, we really made progress. When Greenleaf had turned the platoon over to me, he'd gone back to see how the company as a whole was doing, and found out that we were to stop at the edge of the town and let the 29th Division go on into town from the left and mop up. We had to stop our own people and bring them back to a road that had been designated as a restraining line. I immediately started to consolidate our position. The goal was to put the men in a position so they could dig in an organized manner and arrange for resupply of ammo. No sooner had I done this than the counterattack came. An enemy machine gun crew had moved in on our flank under the cover of enemy artillery fire, and they played havoc for a while. Sergeant Bill Tombrink and Pat Maselli were killed, Frakes was wounded in the shoulder, and I was able to find a hole the enemy had dug for a gun emplacement, so I was lucky. In the meantime, some of our guys spotted the Kraut machine gun crew and killed him. I spotted a Kraut climbing a tree across the road in an orchard, and although the foliage hid him from sight, the wiggling branches gave him away. I emptied a clip interspersed through the tree and saw no more movement. A hedge in front of me obscured my view of the trunk of the tree, so I didn't see him come down, but a man from our flank saw him. I hadn't killed him, but he was wounded and retreating. Captain Lassiter told me to take a reel of sound power wire and a phone over to our flank, where the 1st Battalion was located. This enabled him to relay information to direct artillery fire from our own cannon company, which was actually a battery of 105 howitzers. I would also be able to prevent accidental rounds landing on friendly troops. While on the way over to the other battalion, I was narrowly missed by a round from a sniper that was in our area. The German counterattack was stopped, and we were finally able to consolidate our position. We proceeded to dig in and improve our positions. I took over a dugout the enemy had used as my own spot to get some sleep once all my men were taken care of.
Reflections 11. Life. Ted Neill. There was a further aspect of Grandpa's story that I only learned to talk about, much less to appreciate, after apprenticing under Steve Olson and Jack Hoban. It is a crucial element of the return journey of the heroic quest and the reintegration of the warrior into society. It's centered on the recognition and affirmation of shared humanity, with brethren, with strangers, even with the enemy. This philosophy, mentioned in earlier sections, called the dual life value, is one that Jack Hoban has written at length about in his books The Ethical Warrior and The Ethical Protector. It is at the heart of the trainings he provides to military and police forces the world over. Jack learned it from his own mentor, Professor Robert L. Humphrey, 1929-97, who first proposed it in his own books, Values for a New Millennium and The Warrior Creed. The dual life value is best summed up as a recognition of the sanctity of all life. This can become a central pillar to build upon in conflict resolution between warring parties. When you realize that the highest value for you and your enemy are the lives of your families, that you share commitment and devotion to your loved ones, even above yourself, you create a space of common ground that becomes the starting point for understanding and eventually peace. Humphrey, a veteran of World War II, saw this firsthand in his travels throughout the world as a consultant for the US military, the State Department, and the CIA during the Cold War. Deeply impacted by Humphrey's teaching, Jack Hoban would go on to become one of his most prolific disciples, integrating this approach to the combat and ethics trainings Jack provided to different branches of the military. Jack would go on to propose that the ultimate role of a warrior, who paradoxically at times must take life, is to first and foremost protect life. Through Jack's own scholarship of warriorhood, drawing on texts from ancient Japan to classical Greece, he found ample support for this interpretation, an interpretation that, in the context of modern, impersonal mechanized armies, has been lost. Jack Hoban trained soldiers to shift their self-concept from soldier as killer to that of warrior protector. To drive home this point, during lectures, Jack would project a giant picture of a grizzly bear lumbering along a riverbank somewhere up in the Yukon, and ask his trainees, "If you encountered this in the woods, would you be scared?" "Sure." "Of course," his students would say. Then Jack would show the rest of the photo, revealing two grizzly cubs frolicking in the stream while they trailed after what was actually a mother grizzly. "How many of you would be even more scared now?" Jack would ask. Every hand would go up, heads would nod. I would see people tugging at their collars. They would swallow or laugh uncomfortably. They'd realize Jack was onto something. It wasn't unusual for some to simply speak out, "Hell yeah," or, this being the Marines, "Fuck yeah." Jack would then drive the point home. The mother grizzly is more fearsome not because she is a mindless killer, but because she is a protector of life. On some deep archetypal level inside us, we know that this is the highest calling of anyone who is called into combat, mortal or otherwise. We know that facing someone or something protecting the lives that are precious to them is to face the most fearsome of opponents. Jack goes on to explain that by embracing this ethos of protector of life, which is ultimately selfless and life-affirming, the mere fighter, the conscripted soldier, the faceless, nameless grunt, is transformed into a true warrior. Jack's is a framework, not just for the battlefield, but life in general. The kicker, of course, is that Jack and his mentor Robert Humphrey would push their students one step further with the following concept of the ethical warrior. An ethical warrior is a protector of life. Whose life? Self and others? Which others? All others, if possible. Killing only when necessary to protect life. All life includes even the enemy's life, and that last bit was the revolution in thought Humphrey and Jack proposed. To our modern conceptualizations of warriorhood that imagines a soldier going off to war to protect his or her loved ones, their in-group or tribe, protecting even the enemy's life seems counterintuitive, a fatal weakness. After all, if we recognize that the enemy's life is sacred, like our own, aren't we setting ourselves up to choke at the crucial moment of confrontation? But Humphrey and Jack, like Edward Tick, recognize that what is at stake in the life or death struggle of war is not just the life of a soldier, but their very soul. And the taking of life, even the enemy's, can have a shattering effect on it. This is especially true as we consider the cognitive dissonance of protecting the lives of our comrades while reading in the eyes of the enemy that he is simply doing the exact same thing, living up to his own ideal of loyalty to his brother and protection of his tribe, his in-group. Many soldiers have written in personal accounts that, although they might not like the enemy soldier, they respect him and share a deep understanding of him, a recognition of a shared mission and misery. It is here where we see the edges around our neat and tidy definitions of tribe, in-group, whatever term we use to demarcate us from them, begin to fray. For the soul recognizes a truth that the tribalism of politics would have us forget. That in the end, there is only one tribe, and that is humanity. There is no us versus them. There is not them, even. Just us, we humans, with lives of equal worth. No relative value, no tribal symbol, or in-group membership can supersede that truth. Tick reminds us that the soul, the psyche, the conscience, whatever term you prefer, knows this. The soul does not recognize the imagined distinctions we create, socially and politically, to mobilize our young men and women to march off to war. After all, so many soldiers, my grandfather and Leo included, would testify that it was not abstract thoughts of patriotism or politics that kept them fighting in the trenches. Not even the thoughts of distant loved ones on the home front were as compelling in the urgency of battle as the loyalty to the buddy beside you. He or she is your brethren in a way that no one could truly understand. No one could understand except that enemy soldier fighting opposite you. Soldiers know this. So, when the heat of battle dies down and men and women must reflect on the lives they took, the lives they saw shattered left and right and ahead of them, their souls come under stress. In the tragic examples where, in retrospect, the justification of the fighting eventually is seen as less than noble, as many came to see the war in Vietnam, this weight is even greater, and the psyche cracks beneath it. But when the warrior can pass through the ethical paradox of battle and emerge with a sense that they have remained true to the ideal of warrior, of protector of life, the soul survives, not unscathed, but with fewer wounds. In Jack Hoban's trainings, he would stress that lethal force always had to be a final resort. He insisted upon this even in hand-to-hand combat situations when the fighting is so intense that the intimacy with your enemy is at its deepest and most profound. This is not always an easy choice. Actually, its honor and valor come from the fact that it is difficult. It requires monumental amounts of restraint, forbearance, discipline, and courage. But in the end, this choice preserves the warrior's sense of honor, their identity as protector rather than killer. Given a choice, we all would choose to be a protector rather than a killer, or even executioner. In the end, choosing to protect life allows a soldier to maintain a hold of their own humanity. It's an admittedly high ideal, but can produce stirring examples of courage on the battlefield, such as one Jack would share in his lessons. It took place during a firefight between soldiers loyal to the regime of Saddam Hussein and US Marines during the Iraq War. As the battle lines shifted throughout the course of fighting, a no-man's land emerged between the forces. A pocket of battlefield wherein the wounded from both sides were trapped on the ground while crossfire from the opposing sides whirred overhead. Into this maelstrom of artillery and small arms, a single U.S. Navy corpsman dashed, braving enemy and friendly fire to retrieve his wounded comrades. He did so until he had recovered all the wounded American troops, carrying each on his shoulders to safety. This, for many, would have been an act of bravery and selflessness highly commendable in itself. But it was what he did next that made his actions truly transcendent. This Navy corpsman, his ethic informed by the notion that all life is sacred, that in the final analysis even the enemy is our brother, that to preserve your humanity you must see the humanity of the other, even the man who was just shooting at you. This corpsman went back into the no-man's land to retrieve a wounded Iraqi soldier. When he had carried the last of the wounded Iraqis to safety behind U.S. lines where American medics tended to them, the medics also making distinction between enemy and ally, the corpsman collapsed behind the shelter of a berm to catch his breath. A Reuters journalist embedded with the unit approached and asked him, "Why did you go and save Iraqis? They're your enemies." The Marine, a young 20-something yet to finish college, having acted on an ethic he had internalized but could not articulate as eloquently as his instructors at Quantico had in the classroom, said, panting, "That's what we do."
Recollections of a GI 9. Robert Louis Fowler. July 19th. Reserve. The next morning was July 19th, 1944. St. Lo was cleared, and we were reverted to regimental reserve so that we could move around as long as we were in some type of cover. We'd been forced to wait until after dark the night before to pick up the bodies of Tombrink and Maselli and carry them back to the medics. Tombrink was a big guy, and it was a job for 4 of us to carry him half a mile. This detail was organized by Jungle Jim, and he was one of the 4 carriers. He did not want to wait for the medics or grave registration people. This was a side of Jungle Jim we'd not known until combat. Stateside, Captain Lassiter had been so GI and by the book, we'd never seen any display of emotion or sentiment before. We were able to wash up and shave, and we began receiving replacements. We received enough replacements that the 1st and 2nd platoons were reformed as 2 separate platoons. This meant that I had to look at the 6 men I had left out of the 42 I started with to decide which ones were sergeant material. I had Gill and Tepley, who were assistant squad leaders to begin with, so I made Gill platoon guide and Tepley, Pennington, and Clence my squad leaders. I tried to get Sampson to give me Gordon Weeks, but no dice. I was acting platoon leader and would have eventually received a battlefield commission, which I had really wanted. However, after the platoon was reorganized and we had a couple of days in which we were able to write letters and rest a little, I was called to company headquarters. The 1st platoon had been reorganized also, and Jake Sass had been assigned as platoon sergeant to replace John Cantoni, who'd been wounded. In the meantime, my promotion to technical sergeant had gone through, and I'd replaced Ryan officially. Jake Sass and I had reported to Jungle Jim, and we were introduced to 2 new second lieutenants, fresh from OCS at Fort Benning. There went my battlefield commission. Temporarily, anyhow. My new lieutenant was Stevens, and Jake's was Gallagher. After introducing us, Jungle Jim then told the new officers that the sergeants will remain in command of their respective platoons until he told them differently. Lieutenant Greenleaf had been assigned as company executive officer officially, and the next day he called us in to make our recommendations for decorations. We made a gentleman's agreement that we would make our highest recommendation go to a deserving deceased member. We didn't think we had any Medal of Honor designees. I recommended Buster Brown for the Distinguished Service Cross, thinking he was KIA. His squad leader had reported him to me as KIA, and I took his word for it. From all the reports I received and what I had observed, Buster deserved recognition, and because of the KIA report, we all agreed he was our best candidate. Because of so many heroic and unselfish acts performed by so many, we found it very difficult to pick one deed over another. Lieutenant Greenleaf wrote me up for a Silver Star, but I thought I talked him out of it. However, it was changed to bronze by higher headquarters. It was worth 5 points later, in a point system that was used to assign priority for those of us returning home after things were all over. This point system was unknown at the time, but in my case, it didn't matter one way or the other. During this time in reserve, I happened to see a French man walking up a road with a satchel over his shoulder. This satchel appeared to have some bottles in it. I assumed it was a beverage of some kind and negotiated with him for a bottle of unknown content. Neither one of us could speak the other's language, but the transaction was completed. The fact that my rifle was slung over my shoulder may have helped him understand me better. Because we were in reserve, we could gather in small groups without drawing artillery fire, so I had a few guys help me sample my purchase. I pulled the cork and passed the bottle to my left. The first man to sample it coughed and sputtered, but was able to down a little and retain it, with effort. The bottle proceeded around the group and received in the same manner as the first. When it came back to me, I understood the reactions of the other guys. It was like straight alcohol and needed considerable cutting. We later found out it was Corvados 180 proof, referred to as buzz bomb juice. I gave the balance of the bottle to the first sergeant and never saw it again, nor the first sergeant, for 3 days. July 22nd. After about 3 days in reserve, I was told to get the platoon ready to move out. After receiving some replacements and reorganizing, I had about 19 men, which meant I had 13 new men and 1 new and inexperienced lieutenant, what we called a shave tail. The company, minus 3rd Platoon, was moved over to the other side of St. Lo, and my platoon relieved a platoon of B Company in a position near an asylum. Our positions were dug around a large grotto with a field of fire to our south through an apple orchard. The wall of the asylum was 10 feet high and extended straight away south from my left flank. All of this was on a steep hill with bombed-out buildings in back of us, which were nothing more than rubble. The hill formed a cliff to our rear that could be scaled 1 person at a time. Just above this was a command post with boards across 2 stone rails about 4 feet high. We did have an EE-8A telephone with a wire back to the 1st Platoon, which was just inside a long tunnel. They in turn were wired into company headquarters, which was up by the Cathedral de Notre Dame in St. Lo. While there, we were able to work with Cannon Company Field Office and set up some prearranged barrages. The barrages were given code numbers for specific locations. We could call for barrage number G7 and get fire on a specific crossroads, etc.
Reflections 12. Warriors. Ted Neill. Steve Olson, my boss from the Center for Leadership and Ethics at Georgia State, claimed that the profound lesson of the battlefield, that recognition of not only your mortality, but of the enemy's as well, created better leaders in government and civic life. This hard-earned knowledge fosters a greater understanding of the shared human condition and a deeper level of empathy for all others. Steve felt that the U.S. had benefited in the post-World War II years from the high numbers of leaders in government who were veterans. This gave us warrior elders who, as in traditional societies, carried this wisdom back from mortal combat. In ancient times, these warrior elders took the responsibility of de-escalating conflict and brokering peace within their tribes and with other communities, for they knew firsthand the face of war's suffering and its costs. Steve's theory was that this contributed to the spirit of bipartisanship and a level of civility in national and state government in the US that is all but gone in today's political discourse. I read heartening signs of this warrior ethic in Grandpa's memoir. It was not his fellow GIs who carried Grandpa back to the safety of his own lines when he was shot, but rather surrendered German soldiers. At his memorial service in 2006, when my mother asked me to speak, it was that part of his story that I shared. My father did the same in Grandpa's eulogy. Even at a time in my life when I had yet to meet Steve, Jack, or read the work of Edward Tick, it was this recognition of the humanity of these men that had hours before been his enemies that had stuck with me. When asked to sum up Grandpa's life story in the briefest window, this was the illuminating anecdote both my father and I reached for. Not included in Grandpa's account was how, while waiting for help from the medics in the company of one particular German soldier, Grandpa reached into his pocket and pulled out a picture of his daughter, my mother. Grandpa spoke no German, and the German soldier spoke no English, but the surrendered German reached into his pocket to draw forth his own folded and crumpled picture. It was a picture of his own daughter, about the same age as my mother was at the time. Of all the battles Grandpa fought in life, I think this one was the most important. Recognizing the human in his enemy, being able to switch from a mindset of combat to compassion, was what I believe preserved enough of his soul that, in time, he was able to find sobriety and even some peace in later life. Post-battle, I could see how this recognition was still a crucial litmus test for honor and trust, turning former allies into enemies and enemies into allies. Those who could not make this shift remained enemies, their lives forfeit. I recognized it in Grandpa's story of the American GI from the 320th Regiment that he and his buddy Al Grobe caught looting the bodies of his own fallen brothers. This GI, whom Grandpa never names in his account, had chosen to enrich himself at the expense of his dead brethren. He did this while even neglecting his still living and injured GIs who needed help. This was a betrayal so great, a violation of an unwritten code, that execution seemed called for. It was telling to me that Grandpa was persuaded by Al Grobe not to shoot the GI, only by the idea that they could send him back up the front lines in hopes he would get shot. This redrawing of lines demarking enemy and ally, combat and compassion, was also evident in the fate of members of the SS. Grandpa said these soldiers, even when captured, frequently would not cooperate. They would profess a steadfast belief in their Aryan superiority. They maintained a stance of opposition, and they would frequently try to escape or resist. When I asked Grandpa how the US GIs dealt with the SS as they advanced and began capturing more German soldiers and officers, he shook his head, saying only, "They tended to be walked out into the woods and never made it back." The gestures towards reconciliation that did take place in the aftermath of battle among Grandpa and the Germans who did peaceably surrender served me in my own interactions decades later. While on a trip in Ghana, I met a German girl who had grown up in the German Democratic Republic. This was the eastern side of the Berlin Wall that, throughout my childhood, had been under Soviet control. Upon meeting me, she was defensive and guarded, saying, "I bet your grandparents tell stories about shooting Nazis." "Not exactly," I said. "It was Germans who saved my grandpa, carrying him back to US lines when he was shot." She and I are still friends to this day. I suppose I took to these anecdotes as evidence of Grandpa's own protector-of-life mentality. Like I said, I imagine this contributed to the healing that allowed him to string together a few good years that eventually added up to decades of sobriety. This was when I knew him. These were years when he was available to his daughters, his grandchildren. Grandpa was even able to remain sober when his youngest son, Joe, died unexpectedly of a brain aneurysm just days before his own son, Matthew, Grandpa's youngest grandchild, was born. Yet, I don't want to gloss over the wounds, physical, psychic, and spiritual, that Grandpa and the men he served with suffered from. He told me how so many of them returned only to experience night terrors and panic attacks. Many reported problems managing their drinking. They spoke of frequent drunkenness, blackouts, fighting with their wives, compulsive cheating, and even domestic abuse. Grandpa and his surviving war buddies lost friends to suicide. The demons of war had a deep hold on many of them. Edward Tick emphasizes that the services to support veterans are still woefully inadequate today, and were even less supportive then. And thus the chaos that my mother and her siblings grew up with. In the story of our family, one can even make a strong case for the intergenerational effects of poverty, abuse, and toxic stress. Grandpa's emotional trauma transferred through experience and even epigenetics, in ways researchers are only beginning to understand, to his children and grandchildren. As I've mentioned, among the 14 of us in my generation, around half of us struggle with mental health and substance abuse problems. This includes me. More than a handful of us have experienced institutionalization, homelessness, and/or incarceration. Despite Grandpa's slip when Evelyn died of cancer in 1991, he mainly retained his sobriety unbroken. In the lion's share of his later years, he found some solace living successfully as the elder warrior. He finally fused two of his lifelong loves together, driving and serving his brothers and sisters of the military. On many days of the week, he would shuttle vets in a large 18-seater van to doctor appointments all over the city of Omaha. These were men and women of World War II and other more recent ones, but they all were Grandpa's brothers and sisters. He even donated blood at the VA every 6 to 8 weeks in hopes it could help other veterans undergoing surgeries. For a man who was as taciturn and laconic as Grandpa was, I have few pictures of him in which he is wearing an undiminished and unburdened grin. One is from before the war, when he was a young man having found work, respect, and purpose in the National Guard, before he felt the need to posture and look older, before the clouds of loss gathered behind his eyes. The other is decades later, standing next to that van, coffee cup in hand, and ready to go pick up other wounded warriors, ready for the prick of the phlebotomist needle, still ready to bleed for anyone who needed it. Grandpa had found his place again, in service to others.
Recollections of a GI-10. Robert Louis Fowler. July 23rd. One afternoon, everything was pretty quiet, till suddenly our BAR on the perimeter opened up. I jumped up and moved out to the position immediately, and my BAR man said he had spotted a 3-man Kraut patrol and opened up on him. They had ducked into an opening in the asylum wall and were protected from fire from the BAR. I ran over to the area where I had my reserve squad and tried to get them out of their holes. Pennington was the squad leader, and he was also trying, but all our men were new and scared. Despite our urging, they froze. My intention was to take them around in a flanking movement to see if we couldn't nail the Kraut patrol, but before I could get them moving, one of the Krauts had shot my BAR man and creased his right temple. The shooter then got away, back toward where they had come from. Things quieted down, but now I had a wounded man to get back to the medics. With so many new soldiers, I didn't have a single man that was sure of finding his way back to where the first platoon was. Our own new shaved-tail lieutenant locked up, couldn't speak. I decided to get the injured man back to the medics myself. When I returned to the line, Lieutenant Stevens thanked me for handling the situation. He confessed that he froze and didn't know what to do. I did tell him to stay with the platoon.
During my absence, the 3-man Kraut patrol tried our position once more. One of our guys managed to wound one, but the other 2 got away. The Krauts sent 2 of their medics after their wounded man, and they picked him up and brought him into our position. The medics were wearing Red Cross armbands, as did our medics, so my men didn't fire on them. They brought their own man in and rolled him into a shell hole and left him to die. I checked him. He was badly wounded and didn't have a chance. The German medics asked us to take them prisoner. One kept asking me, "Wo chef?" I told him I wasn't any damn cook, because I didn't know then that he was trying to speak to me in French, because he already knew I didn't understand German. I mentioned earlier that we had removed our stripes, so without insignia of rank it was difficult for them to know who was who. My new men also had this trouble, but they eventually learned to recognize my bark. They did apologize later for freezing, but this was not unusual when men first got to the line. July 25th. After 3 days on the line, a platoon from I Company came up to relieve us at night. I knew we were to return and join up with the rest of the company near the cathedral at certain time. I let Lieutenant Stevens show the relief lieutenant the different positions. They'd been at Fort Benning together, and he had come overseas together. The mistake was letting him talk old times too long. My watch had rusted out from saltwater at Omaha Beach, so I wasn't sure of the exact time. It was tricky calling out a commanding officer, but I finally spoke up that we were late in meeting up with the rest of the company and needed to move. Stevens cut short his reminiscing, and we moved out. The damage had been done, however. We reached the rendezvous at the cathedral late. I had never been chewed out like I was chewed out by Jungle Jim. He really let us have it from both barrels. When we returned back to the reserve area, we were able to get a few hours of sleep. Then Greenleaf called the platoon leaders in. We had to go back over our area where we'd fought from July 15th. We were to plot the location of our dead on a map and also make positive identification. We were told to stick their bayonet in the ground with the rifle on it and the man's helmet on the butt of the rifle. This was one of the most difficult duties we had up until then. These men had been out there for 10 days. Due to mines in the area, the grave registration people were hesitant about going after bodies. I had to check dog tags or pay cards because flesh had fallen away from their faces, which made visual identification impossible. In most cases, I knew where some of them had fallen, so I had some idea of whom I was looking at. One of them was Ralph McManaman, one of my squad leaders, and also one of the guys we played football with in England. He was also one member of the group that had discussed our wound preferences. When we returned from the body location task, we were given a chance to hop on a truck to the rear for showers. The quartermaster had set up a portable shower system. We entered one end and removed all our clothes. We saved our helmets, shoes, and canvas leggings. We then showered with GI soap. It was strong soap, and we needed it. In the beginning, we were short of drinking water, but we could always find large cider kegs. The Krauts always broke the wine and cognac barrels as they retreated, but they didn't bother with the cider, so we usually filled our canteens with it. If a person drank quite a bit of the cider, it could act as a laxative. One time during some heavy shelling, fear overcame my ability to control my bowels. I had to wear those pants until this day when we went back to shower. We were issued all clean clothing, and it felt really good. It was also nice and quiet and peaceful. No artillery, in fact. No war back there. It was tough to climb back on that truck. When we returned back to the unit, we found out the mail and tobacco rations had been brought up. I cried while reading a letter from my mother, telling me not to take any chances and get myself hurt. As I finished reading my mail, Jungle Jim came by and he said, "Sergeant Fowler, while you were gone, the tobacco ration came up, and I saved these for you." He handed me 2 plugs of horseshoe chewing tobacco. This was really appreciated, and a surprise. Back stateside, when we were out of the boonies on tactical problems, it would be necessary for Captain Lassiter to call a conference. Whenever he would ask me a question, I would have to spit before I answered him. Looking back, this was part of my efforts to appear older, but I could always see an annoyed expression on his face when I had to spit. Yet here he was, giving me 2 plugs of tobacco. He sure had changed from the cold, unperturbable Captain Lassiter to a very human person, Jungle Jim. Later on, I found out it wasn't a change in his basic personality as much as his manner of acting, what he perceived a company commander should be like. The time that was spent at this location was used to re-equip ourselves with entrenching tools, grenade pouches, and other items we could attach to our cartridge belts. We also had received additional replacement troops, and we were able to pass on to them some of the tips we found useful. It was during this period of time that Operation Cobra started. The Air Force must have gathered every heavy bomber in England for a daylight bombing mission of a tactical nature. Normally, the big bombers like the B-17 and the B-24 were used for strategic targets, such as enemy aircraft plants and the petroleum plants. In Operation Cobra, they were to saturate an area 1 mile wide and 3 miles long, 3 enemy lines to soften up for Patton's Third Army to pour through and create the breakout from Normandy and to make the dash across France. July 27th. A day or so later, we pulled out of the assembly area and moved back through St. Lo to the south edge of town, near where I had my platoon a few days before. My platoon was to remain at a point known as the LD, line of departure, and the time of departure was 3 p.m. We arrived at the LD about an hour early, so I spread out my men of the 2nd platoon and told them to relax and wait for the order to move out. The 3rd platoon's LD was in the exact area that my platoon position had been a few days before. It was difficult to get up to it unless you knew the exact route. My buddy, Leo Sampson, and his platoon leader, Lieutenant John Campbell, asked me to guide them up there. I told Lieutenant Stevens to stay put and that I would be back in a few minutes, and also what I was going to do. When I returned from guiding the 3rd platoon into position, I was just in time to see the last of my platoon moving out. It was also just in time to meet Captain Lassiter and hear him ask why my platoon was jumping off from the LD ahead of time. I told him where I had been, and he said to get up to the front of the platoon and tell Lieutenant Stevens to get back to the tail end of the platoon and stay there. I was able to get the platoon back to the LD without incident, and we waited for 3 p.m. At that time, all platoons moved out. At the far edge of town, we had to move through a German minefield. These were teller mines, which were meant for anti-tank use. It takes 250 pounds of pressure to detonate these mines, so we were able to move through, carefully. It was all done without enemy fire of any kind. We expected to get fired upon when we left the edge of town and started to move across open fields. We were very vulnerable targets. Regardless, we were to proceed south out of St. Lo for a couple of miles. Then we were to pivot and move east toward the town of Vire. We reached a chateau at the point where we were to turn. L Company, being the left unit, had to stay in place and let I Company on the right make the wide part of the turn. It was during this operation that the enemy opened up. I was with my right squad since they were the link of contact with I Company. We moved out across an open field and closed in around the chateau and the outbuildings. We discovered 21 enemy troops in a barn, and we hadn't received hardly any enemy fire of any kind. We consolidated our position, which allowed I Company to complete their turning movement. They were beginning to get some resistance, but were still pushing forward. I had my platoon up along a hedgerow and was waiting for word to move out when we began getting mortar fire. I knew the best way to react was to move forward, so I told the platoon to move out up to the next hedgerow, but still with so many new troops, I didn't get much results. So I said, "Follow me," and I climbed over the hedgerow and took off across an open field to the next hedgerow, which was only about 100 yards. I looked back, and not one of my men had followed. I moved on up to another hedgerow and everything was quiet. I could hear someone's clothing scratching against stubble, and it seemed to be coming from the other side of the hedgerow. I carefully looked over the hedgerow through some foliage, and there was a crowd starting to run down a road. I couldn't get my rifle lined on him very quickly because of the brush, but when I fired,
he increased his pace. After I fired, an enemy machine gun opened up across the road. About that time, Lieutenant John Campbell and his runners showed up from the 3rd platoon, so we were able to toss a few grenades across the road. Since the target was only about 30 yards away, we would let the safety handle of the grenade flop over after pulling the pin, then count 1, 2, and heave it. It took 4.5 seconds from the time the safety handle released the striker, which started the fuse, to detonation. If you delayed throwing just right, the grenade would explode in the air and scatter the shrapnel better. This also gave the enemy less time to react if they saw the grenade coming. The tactic worked. The machine gun fire stopped and we felt a little more secure in our position. I told Lieutenant Campbell where my platoon was and said I was going back to bring them up. I'd just gotten up on my feet when I felt a blow in my upper left thigh. I knew I was hit. I took a dive back to the ground and rolled over a couple times. This was in grass about a foot high. If it was a sniper, I hoped this would confuse him some. I moved my left leg to see if it was usable. I had full control of it, but it was extremely painful to move it in certain directions. The point of entry was about 4 inches below my left hip bone, and it felt as though the bullet was in my scrotum. That was where the worst of the pain was, and I wondered if the bullet had passed through my thigh to hit me there. I had visions of lying in the grass and being captured or bleeding to death. Even though the bleeding was not bad, my imagination presented a lot of possibilities. I told Campbell I was hit, but I would go back and tell Captain Lassiter to get some help up to Campbell's position. I jumped up and started back to where the platoon was. I found out that fear and shock can overcome a lot of pain. I located Captain Lassiter and told him where Campbell was and that I was hit. Also, I told him where my platoon was and recommended Chester Gill to take my place. My next concern was getting to the aid station back from the front line. We always knew it would be only a few hundred yards to our rear, which it was. One of the sergeants from the weapons platoon came over to me with 2 German prisoners. The sergeant was wounded in the back by shrapnel but still able to function. He made the Germans get on either side of me to help me get to the aid station. The aid station was in a house in St. Lo that wasn't too badly damaged. I was given a morphine shot and also penicillin. I remained on a stretcher for quite some time until a trail was cleared through the rubble of the town. They placed our stretchers crossways on jeeps, which were able to get back through St. Lo to a road where we were taken by ambulance to the field hospital. At the hospital, I was undressed down to my skivvies, shoes, and helmet. I immediately went to sleep from the morphine and was awakened by the feeling that I was being carried, and opened my eyes to find I was on a stretcher with 2 more German soldiers on either end of it. They were also prisoners being put to work. I was x-rayed, but the original x-ray was not positioned correctly to detect the bullet. The medic initially thought I might have been faking the injury to get off the line. I suggested he take the x-ray again, lower this time. After that, he was able to determine where the bullet had lodged. It had ricocheted and lodged in my left ischium, resting near the femoral artery and a nerve that had caused the pain to radiate to my groin. As a result, I enjoyed my first airplane ride on a C-47 hospital plane across the Channel to a hospital near Wrexham, North Wales. November 1944 to July 27th, 1945. 4 months later, I was sent back to France to a replacement depot near the town of Neill for limited duty as an instructor of infantry tactics. The bullet had moved slightly away from the nerve, and I experienced no further pain, even though it is still in there to this day. I was lucky enough to have enough points to be on the first wave returned stateside, and I had the pleasure of seeing Lady Liberty in New York Harbor on July 27th, 1945. After a couple of years, I rejoined the National Guard, still the 134th Infantry, and received my commission as a second lieutenant. 18 years later, I retired as a major. I still feel respectful when I salute the flag.
Reflections 13. Finding St. Lo. Ted Neill. It was the damn 21-gun salute and my grandfather's funeral that broke my resolve and left me in tears. I'd made it through the length of the funeral mass that morning with a sort of flat determination. This allowed me to go through the motions of the service, the 3 readings, a sermon, followed by the consecration of the host, communion, then dismissal. Raised in the Catholic Church, I could follow the well-worn paths mechanically. The familiarity was comforting. But as Grandpa's ashes were carried down the aisle, the reassuring sequence of ritual was shattered by the crack of 3 rifles. 3 service members fired their guns into the sky, while a 4th called out the prompts. Ready? Aim. Fire. Ready. Aim. Fire. They were old men themselves, their dress regalia from different services and different wars, but their faces were uniform with solemnity. They cracked off 7 simultaneous rounds, quick and precise, their lifelong skills polished from the many recent funerals of their contemporaries. It was that unexpected eruption of gunfire that broke through the shell I'd enclosed my own feelings in. Before I could follow the rest of the mourners and family inside, I turned around, sat back down in the pew, and wept. The echoes of the gunfire faded and were replaced by the rising steady hum of respectful conversation. Growing murmurs from the foyer as the mood of the funeral receded and the regular rhythms of life re-established themselves, allowing us all to continue, blissfully forgetting that the hourglass is running for all of us. At least until the next death reminds us that we're all on borrowed time. After what felt like a few minutes, I looked up to see I was all alone in the nave. Everyone had left. Everyone except for my cousin David. David, who is in so many ways my opposite. Fair and blonde, tall, athletically gifted, politically conservative. David, who always displayed a typically Midwestern reserve more like Grandpa than me. He had remained seated, alone in the pews. The shock of the guns had pierced something in Dave, too. Neither of us could even make eye contact in that moment, but I felt a profound gratefulness for him, a sense of solidarity in loss and grieving that words or a look could never convey. His quiet presence alone was enough. Just like Grandpa. That solidarity was shattered later at my Aunt Marianne's home, where a number of us gathered for a meal. While I sat with David, his sister Kathleen, and my Aunt Elise reminiscing about Grandpa around the fireplace, David's mother Margie erupted in the kitchen. She was shouting out in rage that Marianne would choose that afternoon to share stories and complain about Grandpa's out-of-control drinking. His drinking had left deep scars on Marianne's life, however, and she felt she had a right. Margie had been hurt too, but she felt dwelling on it was disrespectful to the father they had just buried and mourned. There was more to him than that, Margie said. I don't even remember the particulars of the other accusations and curse words hurled back and forth. I never even caught sight of the 2 sisters fighting, only heard them as their voices grew louder and more distraught. David, Kathleen, their partners, and I broke for the door, walked to our cars, and left. The brief funeral day armistice between the 5 remaining daughters and 1 son, Bob Jr., of Robert and Evelyn Fowler, the only surviving children, siblings who found themselves feuding even into adulthood, had dissolved. It was a sad intrusion of the truth we all had suppressed in the illusion of harmony that funerals make. That truth was this: the fighting, the fractured family dynamics, the legacy of hurts and disappointments from Robert Louis Fowler would continue long after his death. As families and generations go, that has always been a truism, I'm afraid. Family cycles, family dynamics, good and bad, are eternal, inevitable as they are, as our own human failings and shortcomings. And perhaps, to bring this story of Robert Louis Fowler to some high-gloss Hollywood resolution would feel inauthentic. I think it would even feel incomplete and dishonest in light of the man we knew. But just as family dysfunction feels eternal and inevitable, timeless even, I'm aware that there are other things so cyclical in time that they seem to transcend it. The rise, fall, redemption, and fall again of our heroes, for one. The love-hate, reverence, resentment, seeking, rejecting relationship we have with the generations before us. History has a way of reminding us of this constant churn and burn of human stories. The names and actors change, but the stories and themes remain, becoming familiar. So much so that we recognize the archetypes rising with their own anonymous brilliance out of the dust and wreckage of what were once distinct individuals and personal stories. When I think of those things that are eternal, I also am reminded of those moments in my own life, those peak experiences, those transcendent moments we all share. Points when we transcend the flow of time around us and experience brief contact with something more eternal. Moments when we feel distant from the daily grind of the world, yet intimate with the rest of the universe itself. I've had those moments. Receiving a kiss on the lips while leaning against the wall of a gym, having given a girl starring in a high school play flowers. Climbing to the top of a hill in the Highlands of Scotland where stars hang alongside me while a wind blows in from the North Sea with such force that I have to grip the stone with white knuckles to remain in place. Standing under a shelter, listening to thunder and watching raindrops streak through the light of a flickering street lamp on a balcony in Nairobi. Or sitting on a hill in the prairie with Grandpa, just outside Fort Robinson, one of the stops on our trip across Nebraska together. The Lincoln Town car parked on a roadside close to a privately owned herd of bison. The 1,400-pound animals grazing peacefully while the two of us sit side by side, listening to the music of our youth. Glenn Miller's band playing In the Mood in Grandpa's case, U2's Joshua Tree album in mine. Otherwise, we sit in silence, watching the sun, the color of a flame without smoke, set in a clear sky, the tips of the grass shaking in the wind. I knew Grandpa was a man of many moments like these. In those years of sobriety, when he had a reprieve from the demons of his past and the ghosts that stalked his memories, I would catch him sitting on his back deck, watching the play of light in the cottonwoods of his backyard as the sun rose in the mornings. He was a man to whom the beauty of the natural world was never lost. He was drawn to it and had no shame in showing it. I see it in those moments in his story, when he's an 18-year-old farm boy peeking around the window sash of a train car to catch a glimpse of the moon over the snowfields of Donner Pass. When he's surprised by the flash of a flying fish as it careened over the sparkling waters of the Pacific while he rode a water taxi out to Catalina Island. When he saw the Emerald Isle, the land of his own ancestors, for the first time from the deck of a steamboat and felt the breath go out of his chest. Or playing football in the slanting summer sunlight on the moors of Cornwall. When I consider those moments, I still feel close to him. These were intervals in his own life when he was transported to a place of belonging, of oneness. Maybe he felt whole. I believe he fought for those moments of peace and transcendence as much as he fought for the men at his side. Not to protect it, as we can't protect transcendence. By its very nature, it doesn't need us to. It was beyond him, beyond all of those spaces, where peace is eternal, where the prairie wind is still blowing. I hope he's there now. What have I learned at the end of all this? That perfection is a standard that is too high to hold our heroes up to, for any generation, much less ourselves? Certainly. Even after reflecting on our time together, reviewing his memoirs in detail, it remains hard to guess, for me, what sort of role model Grandpa would be today. I don't know where he might stand on the crises facing our nation now: resurgent racism, sexism, homophobia, environmental degradation, climate change, a rise in xenophobic nativism masquerading as patriotism, police violence and the mass incarceration of people of color, and a national government that is, by turns, corrupt, gridlocked, and authoritarian, with shades of fascism. Then what have I learned? That Grandpa was a war hero? That he was a flawed human being? I knew both those things already. What stands out to me at the end of this, actually, is how closely those two things sit next to each other in the narrative that is Grandpa's life. The triumphs and tragedies intertwined as intimately as lovers, partners like Bob and Evelyn, who coexist together despite the mounting history of hurts and betrayals that accrue over the years. For the vines and creepers that connect us go deep. The ones that heal and the ones that hurt become indistinguishable from one another. This is especially true in Grandpa's case. As I consider those days in Normandy to those days on a hill outside St. Lo and then the years that followed, I see, paradoxically, that the very thing that gave Grandpa's life purpose, that brought valor to his story, was the same thing that broke him. It's true for him and so many of the men who served and died alongside him. It's a twin blessing and curse that we are lucky if we are able to avoid ourselves. Did I find the broader lessons from Grandpa's greatest of generations, some key to build fortitude as we ride out the chaotic national and global landscape of today? Not really. Only some solace that, indeed, things have always been chaotic. Stability is the exception, change the rule. It is also impossible to read Grandpa's story and reflect on his family without growing aware of the poignant truth that the conflicts and movements painted in broad strokes by history have profound and lasting impact on the lives of individuals. These impacts get lost due to their sheer overwhelming number and idiosyncratic nature. They have a granular quality that only comes through in the narrow, limited memoirs of individuals. This is in contrast to the thick history books, which pull back so far to offer us scope that the individual soldier and his unique suffering becomes another number on a morning after action report, a tally in a column, a faceless name incised into the stone of a memorial. Is there some metaphor to draw between Grandpa's broken nature, the contrast between his valor and his venality, that provides some key insight into the character of our nation? Are his cycles from saint to sinner, light to shadow, a reflection of our own? The angel and devil on either of his shoulders, the same opposing voices of virtue and vice that have alternatively steered the course of our nation? Or could that just be me reaching too far, trying to force a tidy ending that I promised not to? A glossy resolution that, in the fullness of time, isn't really there. Who knows what our country will be in the light of history, after so many of cycles from heroes to villain, liberators to oppressors, from city on a hill to a pit of corruption. It's impossible to see from here to which side the scales will fall. But we know, in time, they will. I don't feel guilt for speculating. There's no shame in wondering, in trying to make meaning out of meaninglessness. As Edward Tick would remind us, it is what we humans have always done. Yearn for meaning, impose order, seek out narrative structure in the mess of our lives, a structure that will offer some purpose for it all. Yet, despite the long view of deep time, one thing I am aware of is that when considering our decisions in the present and the immediate future, our choices now do matter. A reflection on the lives of my aunts and uncles and my cousins in the wake of Grandpa's life confirms that truth for me. So, we should do our best to make the right choice. Otherwise, future generations might find us wanting. Will our legacy be one of pain and loss, or love and healing? In each moment, the decisions we take, the choices we make, tip those scales in one direction or another. And if there is one thing I have learned from being curator of sorts of all these stories, it is this. The coming generations, those younger than we, they are already watching, waiting, and judging. And they will bear the burden of the choices in our present.